My name is Ellen Parker. I'm 52 years old. And on New Year's Day, I learned something I should have understood decades ago. That morning, I walked into my parents' living room with a small gift bag in my hand. Nothing expensive, just thoughtful. The kind of thing you bring when you still believe showing up matters. The house was warm. The coffee was already brewed. Wrapping paper covered the floor. My sister was laughing, holding up a new jacket. My brother was already talking about a weekend trip my parents had paid for. Even my nephew had a box in his lap, tearing into it with both hands. I sat down on the edge of the couch and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. No one said my name. No one looked my way. It was as if I were furniture, something familiar enough to ignore. Finally, I smiled and asked as lightly as I could, did I miss my turn? The room went quiet. My mother didn't hesitate. She didn't soften it. She didn't even look embarrassed. She just said, "Why would we still spend money on you?" Then she added something that landed harder than the words themselves. You walked away from this family. You're basically just here out of habit. No yelling, no argument, just a sentence that erased me. I stood up. I set my gift down on the table. I told them they'd probably need it more than I would. And I walked out into the cold January air, realizing something that would change everything. Because what they didn't know, what they had never bothered to understand, was that the daughter they treated like she didn't exist was the one quietly holding their entire world together. By the next morning, a single package arrived at my parents' house. No return address, no explanation, just numbers. And inside that box was the truth they had spent years hoping I'd never look at. If you've ever been the one your family overlooks, the one they only remember when something breaks, I want you to stay with me. And if stories like this matter to you, take a second now to subscribe to this channel. These are the kinds of stories people don't tell out loud, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Because what happened after that package was opened didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, legally, and in a way no apology could undo. The question is, if you were in my place, would you stay silent to keep the peace? Or would you finally stop protecting people who never protected you? Stay with me. People like to say families fall apart because of one big moment. A fight, a betrayal, someone slamming a door and never coming back. But that's not how it happened with us. In my family, the distance started quietly. Years before anyone said it out loud. Years before New Year's Day made it impossible to ignore. I grew up in a house where being useful mattered more than being seen. My parents ran a small, family-owned hardware supply business on the edge of town. It wasn't fancy, but it paid the bills. At least, that's what they liked to say. My sister Linda was the one everyone noticed. She had the easy smile, the loud laugh, the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. Customers remembered her name. Vendors asked for her opinion. My mother liked to say Linda had the people touch. I didn't. I was the quiet one. The kid who stayed in the back office after school, organizing invoices, fixing the old computer when it froze, teaching myself spreadsheets because no one else wanted to. When something broke, they called me. When something worked, they forgot how it happened. That pattern followed me into adulthood. I left town in my late 30s for a job in Seattle. Nothing dramatic, no big announcement. Just a better opportunity doing compliance and systems work for a regional logistics firm. To my family, that was the moment the story got rewritten. Suddenly, I was the one who left, the one who chose strangers over blood, the one who thought she was better than the business. What they never mentioned was how often they called after I moved, how many evenings I spent on the phone walking my father through payroll software, how many weekends I drove back down to help straighten out inventory records no one else wanted to deal with. I didn't leave the family. I just stopped being physically present enough to be taken for granted in person. And for a while, that seemed to work for everyone. Whenever I came home for holidays, I was treated like a guest, a polite one, the kind you offer coffee to, but don't ask for input. At family dinners, Linda talked about customers and plans. My parents nodded along. I listened. If I mentioned work, the conversation drifted. If I asked questions about the business, my mother waved it off. "We've got it handled," she'd say. "You don't need to worry about that stuff anymore." It sounded kind. It wasn't. It meant I was no longer considered part of the core, just someone who passed through. I started noticing how often decisions were made without me. Loans, new suppliers, equipment purchases, things that affected everyone, but somehow never required my input. And every time I felt that familiar tug, the urge to step in to fix things before they went wrong, I reminded myself of what they believed. That I had walked away, that I didn't belong in those conversations anymore. Looking back now, I can see how convenient that belief was. Because while I was being slowly pushed to the edges, emotionally, something else was happening behind the scenes. The business was struggling, not in the dramatic way people talk about. No foreclosure notices taped to the door, no headlines, just late payments, strained vendor relationships, cash flow that never quite matched what the sales numbers promised. I saw it in small comments, little slips in conversation. My father mentioning how tight things felt, my mother joking about juggling bills, and every time I offered to look at the books, the answer was the same. "We don't want to bother you. You've got your own life now." It took me years to understand what that really meant. They didn't want me to look, because once I did, I wouldn't be able to pretend everything was fine. And neither would they. By the time New Year's Day came around, the roles had already been decided. Linda was the heart of the family business. My parents were the pillars holding it up, and I was the daughter who had chosen to leave, the one they no longer needed to impress, or include, or acknowledge. What none of them realized, what they had never stopped to consider, was that the farther they pushed me out emotionally, the more dangerous it became for them to assume I wasn't paying attention, because I always was. And soon, I was going to see something they never meant for me to find. 5 years earlier, before New Year's Day turned everything inside out, my family's business was already in trouble. They just didn't like to call it that. On the surface, things looked fine. The doors were open. Customers still came in. The shelves were stocked. But underneath the numbers were starting to bend in ways numbers shouldn't. I noticed it during one of my routine calls with my father. He was complaining about how hard it had become to keep up with suppliers, how every month felt tighter than the last. He said it casually, like it was normal. That night, after we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table in Seattle and did something I hadn't done before. I asked him to email me the latest financial reports. He hesitated. Then he sent them anyway. I remember staring at my laptop as the files loaded, feeling that slow, sinking pressure in my chest. Sales looked decent, too decent, but the cash on hand didn't line up. Expenses were floating from one month to the next. Payments were being pushed, shuffled, delayed. This wasn't bad luck. It was mismanagement, quietly bleeding the business dry. The next weekend, I drove down to Oregon and sat at the same dining table where I'd done my homework as a teenager. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I just laid the numbers out. My mother crossed her arms and said she didn't like spreadsheets. My sister rolled her eyes and said small businesses were always messy. My father listened, and when I told them the truth, that if nothing changed, they were a few bad months away from losing everything, the room went very still. That was the night I made an offer I shouldn't have had to make. I would put up my own savings. Not a loan, real money. Enough to clear the most dangerous debts and buy them time. In exchange, I wanted something simple: transparency, formal ownership shares, and permission to rebuild the system that tracked their money. My mother hated the idea immediately. She didn't like me having access, didn't like the word control. My father hesitated longer, but fear has a way of making decisions easier. They signed. So did my sister, even though she barely glanced at the papers. They all assumed the same thing, that this was temporary, that I'd step in, clean things up, and then step back out again. They were wrong. I went back to Seattle and started working. During the day, I kept my regular job. At night, I rebuilt the business from the inside out. I designed a system that tracked every sale, every payment, every deposit. Nothing fancy, just clean, clear data. No more guessing. No more we'll figure it out later. When it finally went live, the effect was immediate. Late fees stopped piling up. Suppliers relaxed. The panic eased. On paper, I had saved the business. In reality, I had given them a tool powerful enough to expose anything they didn't want exposed. And that's when something strange happened. Nothing about how they treated me changed. At a small celebration dinner, my mother stood up, raised her glass, and thanked Linda for keeping the heart of the business alive. Everyone applauded. Then she smiled in my direction and said, "And Ellen helps with the technical side." That was it. No mention of the money. No acknowledgement of the risk I'd taken. Just a vague label that made it sound like a hobby. I told myself it didn't matter. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need praise. I had done what needed to be done. But the truth was, I had slipped into a familiar role. The one in the background. The one who fixes things quietly. The difference this time was that I could see everything. Every dollar flowing in. Every dollar flowing out. I could see patterns forming. At first I told myself I was imagining things. That I was being overly cautious. After all, this was family. People who had raised me. People I wanted to trust. So I watched and waited and told myself that if something was wrong, it would correct itself. It didn't, because while I had built the system to protect the business, someone else had learned how to use it for their own comfort. And they were counting on one thing above all else, that I would stay silent, that I would keep choosing peace over truth. That assumption was about to cost them more than they ever imagined. By the time New Year's Day came around, the system I had built was no longer new. It had been running quietly in the background. For years, I didn't check it obsessively. I didn't hover over it. That was part of the trust. But the night I walked back into my apartment, after being told I didn't belong anymore, something pushed me to open it. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was instinct. Or maybe it was the feeling that once you're treated like you don't exist, you finally stop protecting other people's comfort. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at my desk. No anger. No plan. I just logged in. At first, everything looked normal. Sales were strong. Stronger than I expected for that time of year. Then I pulled up the deposit reports, and that's where the numbers stopped lining up. Not by much at first, just enough to make me tilt my head and look again. A few hundred here, a little more there. I told myself what anyone would. Cash is messy. Small businesses aren't perfect. So I scrolled back. 1 month, then another, then a year. The gap didn't close. It widened. Gross sales stayed high. Reported income dipped just enough to slip under certain thresholds. Always in the same direction. Always benefiting the same people. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The one I used to get as a kid when something felt wrong, but no one wanted to talk about it. I pulled transaction-level data. Every sale. Every payment method. Card transactions matched almost perfectly. Cash didn't. And that was the moment the truth became unavoidable. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't sloppy bookkeeping. It was a pattern. I sat there longer than I realized, staring at the screen as years rearranged themselves in my mind. The jokes about cash being easier. The way my mother brushed off my questions. The confidence with which they told me everything was under control. They hadn't just ignored my work. They had learned it. They had learned exactly where the blind spots were, and they trusted that I would never shine a light into them. My hands were steady as I exported the data. I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I saved everything. Daily summaries, monthly reconciliations, internal notes where cash was mentioned casually, like it didn't matter. Then I noticed something else. My name, on filings, on documents submitted without my review. They hadn't just used my system. They had used my position. If this ever came apart, it wouldn't just be their problem. It would be mine. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of that settle. For years, I had told myself that staying quiet was kindness, that loyalty meant absorbing discomfort, so other people didn't have to. But this wasn't discomfort. This was risk, legal risk, financial risk, the kind that ruins lives quietly, years after everyone else has moved on. I thought about walking away, about deleting the files and pretending I had never looked. I thought about holidays, about my nephew, about how much easier it would be to stay the invisible one. Then I thought about that sentence. Why would we still spend money on you? And something inside me hardened. They had already decided how much I was worth. They had already decided what they could take. The difference was, now I knew. I copied everything onto an external drive. Not as an accusation, not as a threat, just as a record. Before I shut the laptop, I checked one last thing. How long this had been happening. The answer made my stomach drop. Years, long before that New Year's morning. Long before I was treated like an afterthought. This wasn't about a holiday. It never had been. It was about control and the assumption that I would always choose family peace over personal ruin. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of my apartment, listening to the city outside. I still hadn't decided what I was going to do, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. If this came out later, and I had done nothing, I would be standing in the wreckage with them. And I wasn't willing to disappear for people who had already erased me. The next step wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional, but it would change the balance of power in a way none of them were prepared for. And it would start with a decision I had been putting off my entire life. I didn't send the data right away. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't raise alarms. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that knowing the truth was enough. Then my phone started ringing. At first it was my sister. She showed up at my apartment 2 days later, like nothing was wrong. Like we were just two siblings catching up after the holidays. She stood in the hallway, holding a coffee. She hadn't finished wearing a coat that still smelled like my parents' house. She smiled too quickly. "Can we talk?" she said. I stepped aside. She walked in slowly, looking around, like she was seeing my life for the first time. The clean desk, the monitors, the quiet. Then she got to the point. "Mom is really upset," she said. "She's barely sleeping." I waited. "They know you've been looking at the numbers," she added carefully. "They're scared you're going to overreact." Overreact. That word landed exactly the way it always had. I asked her what she thought I was overreacting to. She sighed and sat down like this was exhausting for her. "Ellen, you know how small businesses work," she said. "Cash gets messy. People do things the old way." She leaned forward, then lowering her voice. "And if this turns into something official, it could ruin everything." There it was, not concern for me, concern for consequences. She started listing what could be lost. The house, the business, my nephew's school. Each sentence wrapped in the same message. Do you really want to be the reason this family falls apart? I felt it then. That familiar pressure. The role I'd been trained for. Fix it quietly. Carry it alone. I told her I wasn't trying to ruin anyone. "I just want the truth to match the records," I said. Her expression changed. She straightened up, irritation flickering across her face. "You've changed," she said. "You left. You don't understand how hard this is for them." The words were old, rehearsed. She accused me of choosing my career over family, of forgetting where I came from, of caring more about numbers than people. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up fixing problems no one else wanted to touch. All the times I'd been called only when something broke. I told her that. She waved it off. That was your choice, she said. No one asked you to do all that. That hurt more than I expected, as if my effort only mattered when it was invisible. She stood up pacing now. Look, she said, if there's a mistake, we can clean it up quietly. There's no reason to bring outsiders into this. Outsiders. That's what accountability was to her. I asked her a simple question. If there's nothing wrong, why are you all so scared? She didn't answer. She grabbed her coat instead. This isn't you, she said on her way to the door. You used to put family first. I let the silence stretch before I responded. Maybe that's the problem, I said. Maybe putting family first is how I ended up carrying things that were never mine. After she left, my parents called. My mother cried. My father spoke quietly, like he always did, when he wanted to sound reasonable. They talked about stress, about pressure, about how hard it was to keep everyone employed. They never denied the numbers. They just reframed them. Mistakes, misunderstandings, things that could be handled internally. At one point, my mother said something that finally snapped the last thread holding me in place. Why would you do this to us? After everything we've done for you. There it was, the debt I could never repay. The loyalty that only flowed one direction. I realized then that if I stayed silent, nothing would change. They weren't asking for understanding. They were asking for protection, and they were offering guilt in return. That night, I sat alone at my desk and opened the files again. Not with anger, with clarity. I wasn't choosing between family and truth. I was choosing between being complicit and being free. The next call I made wasn't to my sister. It was to an attorney. And that was the moment the story stopped being emotional and started becoming unavoidable. The attorney didn't raise her voice. She didn't sound shocked. She just listened. I explained who I was, what role I held in the business, and what I had found. I told her about the system I built, the reports, the patterns. Then I asked the question I had been avoiding since the moment I opened those files. If I know this is happening, I said, and I stay quiet, what does that make me? She didn't hesitate. It puts you at risk, she said. And if this comes out later, they will absolutely try to shift the blame. That was the moment the decision stopped feeling emotional. It became practical. She walked me through my options. One of them involved stepping back completely and hoping the problem fixed itself. Another involved documentation, disclosure, letting the appropriate authorities decide what the truth meant. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just didn't want my name attached to something that could destroy me. So I did the one thing I had never done before. I chose myself. I submitted the records, quietly, carefully. Not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a majority owner, protecting her own future. There was no dramatic fallout at first. No sirens, no confrontations, just silence. Months passed, then the letters started arriving. Official envelopes, neutral language, an audit, a request for clarification, questions that didn't accept emotional answers. From what I heard later, my parents hired help. They told their story. They tried to explain the gaps. They said the same things they had said to me. Mistakes, stress, confusion. But paperwork doesn't respond to guilt. The deeper the review went, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't an accident, and eventually there was a determination. Back taxes, penalties, interest that had been growing quietly for years. The business couldn't absorb it. First they closed one location, then another. Equipment was sold, leases were broken. The house went next, the one where every holiday had taken place, the one I had walked out of on New Year's Day. They moved into a small rental across town, somewhere cheaper, somewhere no one recognized their last name. The fallout didn't stop with money. My father's health declined under the stress. My mother stopped talking about the business like it was part of her identity. My sister tried to pivot, tried to distance herself from the brand she'd once built her image around. But stories travel, and trust doesn't reset just because you change the setting. They called me, more than once, sometimes angry, sometimes broken. They said I'd ruined everything, that I could have handled it privately, that I had chosen numbers over people. I listened. Then I said the only thing that mattered. I didn't ruin your lives, I said. I stopped protecting choices I didn't make. After the final sale went through, my remaining shares were transferred. The wire hit my account quietly. It wasn't a windfall, but it was enough. Enough to start over on my own terms. I moved back to Oregon, not to their neighborhood, not to their world. I bought a small place near the river, somewhere quiet, somewhere my name didn't come with expectations. I set up my desk facing the water and opened a new file, a new project, something designed to help small business owners see problems before they turn into disasters. Transparency instead of denial, prevention instead of cleanup. There was something healing about that. Using the same skills that once made me invisible to build something honest. I still think about my family sometimes, not with anger, with clarity. They didn't lose everything because I spoke up. They lost it because they believed silence was guaranteed. These days, my life is smaller, calmer. I wake up without dread. I work. I walk. I drink my coffee in peace. And for the first time in a very long time, I'm not carrying someone else's secrets. If there's anything this story has taught me, it's this. Karma doesn't need your hands. It just needs the truth and enough time to catch up. As someone who has spent years working with family businesses, financial disputes, and quiet conflicts that never make it to the dinner table, I can tell you, this story is not as rare as people think. What makes it painful isn't the money. It's the belief that love requires silence. Many families confuse loyalty with obedience. They teach one person to carry the weight, smooth the edges, and absorb the consequences, so everyone else can feel comfortable. Over time, that person stops being a son or a daughter. They become a buffer. What happened here wasn't revenge. It was a boundary. When systems are built on denial, they eventually collapse under their own weight. Not because someone spoke up, but because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. From a professional standpoint, staying silent would not have protected this family. It would have only delayed the damage and widened the blast radius. Choosing honesty early often feels cruel. Choosing silence feels kind. But silence almost always costs more in the end. What stands out most to me is not the fallout, but the clarity that followed it. Walking away from dysfunction is not abandonment. Refusing to lie is not betrayal. And protecting your future is not selfish, even when the people who benefit most from your silence call it that. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one who fixes things quietly or carries responsibility no one else wants, you're not alone. Stories like this exist because they need to be told. If you find value in these real emotional family stories, stories about boundaries, consequences, and healing, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps these conversations reach people who may need them more than they realize. And before you go, I'll leave you with one question to think about. If telling the truth cost you a place in a family that only values you when you're silent, was that ever a safe place to begin with? Thank you for staying until the end.